Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 31, Chapter 31. Hitoshi frowns to himself as he follows the flickering lights. Truth be told, the follow the light idea they'd come up with, which at the time had seemed like a good idea in theory, the one that was really their only idea actually, considering how limited communication was with the afterlife, was when the ghost seeing and speaking to teenager was MIA. It turned out to be harder than Hitoshi had thought it would have been, walking into the hospital. The hospital is huge, which he probably should have expected but hadn't, is probably the first note that Hitoshi would make. It's huge and there's dead ends, and lots of rooms, and it's very easy to get lost if you don't know where you're going. And if Hitoshi didn't know any better, he might think that the ghost he's following might have gotten a little lost too in the middle there. He's certain they did a full loop of the third floor twice, before being led back to the elevator, where the overhead lights had fluttered promptly, almost urging Hitoshi back into the elevator with haste. Hitoshi had never thought that lights could appear sheepish, but they certainly had when he'd shot the elevator light an annoyed look upwards after pressing the fourth floor button. He's never seen a light shudder and dim like that, and so he assumes that it's a muted apology from the ghost. It honestly takes a while to make his way through the hospital. Not only does progress stop completely as he sharply looks away from any flickering lights when anyone, a nurse, doctor, orderly, or visitor, turns a corner or passes by, but the lights, as if sensing Hitoshi's hesitance to be caught, gawking at a flickering light, abruptly return to full brightness whenever anyone appears. And that, if you can imagine, in a busy hospital, is near constantly happening. Then there's the fact that the ghost can't convey which floor they're supposed to be on. Hitoshi had stood for a good minute and a half when he'd first gotten into the elevator, for the first time, waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. The light overhead had flickered ominously, slowly, but none of the floor numbers had lit up like they'd been pressed. He'd stood like an idiot in a closed, unmoving elevator and hadn't touched anything while waiting for the ghost to do it for him. For the person leading him, the one with the actual knowledge, the one without an actual hand or physical body to press the button. For the second time in such a short amount of time, Hitoshi feels like an idiot. He wonders if that's a limitation of Rose right now. Izuku had said something about being the ghost's energy source, hadn't he? Was Izuku's absence limiting Rose's abilities? The ghost hadn't thought that he'd be able to hold a game console controller, and when Hitoshi had asked about a pencil and a sheet of paper, the ghost had also vetoed that, which doesn't make much sense considering a pencil isn't really much more than a stick of pocky. But anyways, now's not the time to be thinking about it. It had taken an embarrassingly long amount of time to realize that he probably should do something if the ghost wasn't, so he'd pressed the button for the next floor since there was no other tell as to which floor they were supposed to be on. Which then started their adventure of walking the entirety of each floor until arriving back at the elevator, which Hitoshi took as a cue to move up to the next floor. That process continued until they finally arrived on the fourth floor, which is when the lights started flickering hurriedly, almost excited. Hitoshi takes that to mean that they'd finally found the right floor, for whatever Ro was trying to show him. Still, he follows cautiously after the flickering line of overhead lights. He really has no idea where he's being led, not even the slightest, but he'd tried asking additional questions before throwing in the towel when the ghost hadn't really answered. He really does assume Ro has a plan here. Or he really, really hopes he does. And that it doesn't involve either of his uncles, because he very much would be screwed if Uncle Sho even caught wind of the news that Hitoshi was in the hospital after a villain attack he had literally zero part in. Hitoshi knows he's arrived at the correct location when the flickering light makes an abrupt, almost jump from right in front of him to skipping over 3 lights in the middle before blinking slowly, almost like it wasn't blinking at all, outside a hospital room. He doesn't know what he'd been expecting, but it certainly isn't a glance into a room filled with Izuku's classmates, of Shota's students. The entirety of 1A stands tensely around a bed, low murmurs of tense and frustrated voices filling the room. Hitoshi peeks in through the doorway, taking care to keep himself hidden to the best of his abilities while also being able to look in. The light in the hospital room blinks once in invitation, which none of the 1A kids seem to notice. Hitoshi glares at the light, but it doesn't draw any more attention to itself. Hitoshi, for a brief moment, thinks about turning on his heels and leaving. He doesn't know how he'd even explain his presence to a group of his uncle's students. He doesn't know most of these kids, hardly knows the ones that Izuku had suckered him into spending lunch with, and he doesn't know what Ro wants him to do with 1A. He wants to leave, but he knows he can't. He can't do that to Izuku. They're friends. Cousins. He'll do anything he can to help his friend, and, well, he literally can't leave. Shinso? Hitoshi knows the voice of Ida Tenya. They'd been friends of relation since as far back as Hitoshi can remember. They'd used to have dumb playdates since they'd both been in diapers, despite the fact that his uncle and Ida's older brother hung out often, times arranged the two of them to tag along for socialization purposes. They hadn't really stayed friends. Ida's family was wealthy, and there had always been an upbringing rift between them. Not that he doesn't like the guy or anything. They're just from different worlds, and things like school and where they live, how they live got in the way of growing up. Not to mention their vastly different personalities that had them butting heads more often than not. Tenya went to fancy private schools, and Hitoshi suffered through public school because it's not like they were wealthy or anything. After they both got their quirks and started school, they stopped seeing each other as much. It's not like Eraserhead and Ingenium, two busy debuting pro heroes, had the time to arrange playdates, so after that, they only really saw each other at gatherings and holidays. But still, as his name is called tightly by Tenya, and eyes, literally every eye in the room jerks to him at Tenya's call of his name, rings loudly through their near-instant silence, he knows he can't bolt. Well, he could, probably, but he won't. Ida, Hitoshi greets tensely in reply, swallowing down his nerve as he fully steps into the doorway. Uraraka, Asui, Todoroki. He greets those that he knows and waves sheepishly at those remaining. Hey. There's a bit of an uncomfortable silence as everyone just stares at each other, or, more fitting would be Hitoshi glancing awkwardly around the room and they all glare at him. Well, glare isn't quite right, but it's not wrong either. Ida, stepping forwards, seemingly taking control of his peers and the situation, crosses his arms over his chest and frowns thoughtfully. What are you doing here, Shinso? What do you think I'm doing here? Shinso huffs back, arms crossing over his chest to match Ida. He hopes it comes off as calm and indifferent, but the tension grates at his nerves, and he'd just quite literally been dropped into a room of 1A kids, thanks for that, Ro. There probably could have been some way to offer a warning or something. Who'd have thought the ghost could be an asshole? Who's this? A spiky red-haired teen asks, eyes narrowed and accusingly. This is Shinso Hitoshi, Asui introduces calmly. He's Midoriya-kun's friend from General Education, Kero. He's the one who battled Deku during the sports festival, the match before Deku and Todoroki-kun's match, Uraraka adds easily. He's been having lunch with us recently, right, Ida? Hitoshi rubs awkwardly at the back of his neck. He'd never liked it when people talked about him when he was right there, but he's glad that they're answering. Probably better than that the 1A kids explain who he is to other 1A kids. Easier to believe that he's an ally that way. That's true, Ida offers slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. That doesn't explain why you're here right now, Shinso. I know what happened. Hitoshi interrupts coolly, letting his features settle in a way that he hopes doesn't come off as nervous as he narrows his eyes. There's no point beating around the bush, he knows, so they don't have to censor themselves. He's in on the secret. And how do you know that? The student with tape dispensers for elbows asks with a suspicious glare. How do you know something happened, huh? And he does not have an answer for that. Not a believable one, at least. I followed a ghost. My uncles, your two senseis, called my mother, Aizawa's sister, to inform her that Izuku, Aizawa's foster kid, and your classmate, who's technically sorta my cousin by relation, has been kidnapped. He wants them to trust him. He wants to be let in on this meeting of the minds, or whatever it is the 1A kids get up to, and he knows without a doubt that if he says either of those things, he'll probably get security called on him, or worse, Uncle Shota. He's probably stammering like a fool because the longer he sits and thinks about it, the more insane any of his responses sound. That's what he gets for blindly following a ghost, he supposes. He'll make sure to tell Izuku that his ghost friend is a cunning asshole when he sees him next. Shinso has a family member who's close to Midoriya's guardians, Ida says, snapping Hitoshi from his thoughts. Hitoshi can just shoot the other teen a thankful look. Ida turns away sharply when he notices, like he feels bad for providing an excuse to his peers. But still, that doesn't explain why you're here, Shinso. I want to help. Hitoshi musters up all of his courage and steps more into the room. He tries to hold himself like he belongs there, but he's not sure it really works. Izuku's my friend. One of my best friends, and there has to be something I can do to help him. I know without a doubt that he'd run through hell for me, for any of us. I'll do the same for him. Please, please tell me if you guys have a plan. Why would we even tell you if we had a plan? You're not even in heroics. The tiny purple bald-haired one spits out with a glare, and Hitoshi swallows down the burning rage that wants to consume him. It would be so easy to punt-kick that little bastard into the ceiling, but he shows some restraint. Until the idiot just doesn't know when to quit. A little useless here, aren't you? And who the hell are you? Hitoshi snaps snidely, knowing the asshole will take the bait. Listen here, you... The growl is cut off as his eyes glaze over. Satisfaction settles in Hitoshi's stomach as he gives the teen under his quirks effect an unsatisfied once-over. It didn't take much to figure out who this kid is. This must be the one that he hears the most through the rumor mill around school. Mineta. Gross. Even Izuku doesn't have much nice to say about the kid, and Izuku is practically sunshine. Walk out that door. Hitoshi orders stiffly, distasteful, gaze not straying from the other teen. And walk 200 laps around the wing of this hospital. Don't bother anyone. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just walk quietly. Don't come back until you're finished, and when you do return, say nothing until this conversation is finished. Like clockwork, the tiny bastard slips through the mob of his classmates and walks right out the door after Hitoshi steps out of his way. Good riddance. Hitoshi watches him leave with a glare before turning back to the remainder of 1A. They're all staring. He blinks back at them. Shinso, you know you're not supposed to use your quirk without a license. Ida huffs out. It's a losing battle, and it is. It's not like the first time he said that to Hitoshi, and it won't be the last. Ida has always had a stick up his ass, squawking about illegal quirk usage all the time when they were little, and Hitoshi's control still wavered. He'd learned to ignore it, especially when Ida Tensei had patted him on the back, and he told him not to take Tenya's stickler nature to heart. Honestly, I have no idea how you're related to your uncle. Are you saying you like his company? Hitoshi cocks an eyebrow, glancing around the room. The girls stuck their heads, and most of the boys look away guilty. No one corrects him. There are worse things that I could have done than send him for laps. He's just getting some exercise. Now, can we get back to the topic of my missing best friend? How do you know we have anything planned? The student with the tail asks slowly. This is something best left to the teachers, police, and pros, isn't it? We should stay out of it. For a second, Hitoshi's brain buffers. Did he hear that right? How can you just sit back and not want to help? Hitoshi knows his eyebrows must have furrowed. He's confused. Astounded, really. These are 1A students, and their classmate has gone missing. They're just going to sit back and wait for him to be found. It's not that we don't want to help, Kero. Asui replies softly, tongue peeking out of the corner of her mouth. She frowns at Hitoshi when he just narrows his eyes at her. Asui wilts slightly under Hitoshi's storming gaze as she tries to figure out how to continue, how to explain that they want to help but won't. Sue's right. Uraraka gives a little nod from where she's seated on the edge of the hospital bed. Hitoshi looks past the gravity-quirked girl and to the head of the bed where a thoughtful Yaoyorozu sits. He faintly remembers Yaoyorozu. He'd only met her in passing just recently when she'd come to ask Izuku a question over lunch. She'd seemed nice. His gaze crawls back to Uraraka when she pipes up again. I'm just as worried about Deku as you are, Shinzo-kun, but there really isn't much that we can do to help. We're just students. So let me get this straight. You want to help. Hitoshi narrows his eyes as his arms lace over his chest. But you won't, because what? You're just students? Because the pros will handle it? Because they might be mad that you're doing what heroes are supposed to do? I thought that you guys were supposed to be the heroes. Isn't that what we're all trying to do here? Hitoshi pauses, glaring at each and every face in the room. Some glare back, while others just look annoyed or nervous, and he gets it. He's prickly on the best of days, and more so when he's stressed. And he knows it's probably not right that he's firing shots at them after what he can imagine was a traumatic night, but at the same time, he's been holding these kids up on a pedestal that they clearly don't deserve to be on if this is what 1A truly is. That wasn't what he expected. For 1A kids to be like, not according to Izuku's raving mutters of 1A, at least. Standing before these kids, Hitoshi doesn't see what Izuku does. He's not sure that he'll ever see what he sees. Because this first impression is what Hitoshi will remember. This isn't a group of heroes in training who will stop at nothing to rescue their friends. You know, Hitoshi offers icily when none of them say a thing. I worked my ass off. to try and get into your class. I fought tooth and nail at the sports festival to try and transfer in because you're supposed to be the best of the best. I want to help people. I want to be a hero, but I'm not sure I want to be in a class anymore like this. If this is what you do when your classmate's been kidnapped, when he needs you, when he needs help, and you're just sitting around waiting for someone else to take care of it. Shinso, Ida scolds, glaring daggers at the purple-haired teen, and maybe he's being too hard on them. He probably is. He really does empathize. He gets it, their situation. They're probably scared and hurt, and they're all still students after all. He imagines they're worried, too. They've known Izuku longer, even if Hitoshi had gotten closer. On one hand, they're probably doing the right thing, being reasonable, thinking things through and being smart about it. They're looking at this and seeing danger, seeing trouble for themselves if they get caught. They're being smart. But they aren't being good friends. He knows his uncle would prefer they stay put, would prefer to know that they're safe, and Hitoshi knows that. That's the one thing he has over 1A. He's known Aizawa Shota his literal entire life. He knows what his uncle would want, and it's probably not this. He knows that his uncle is going to lose his goddamn mind when he gets wind of it, but Hitoshi can't find it in himself to care because it's Izuku. It's Izuku that's missing, and if Hitoshi knows anything about the green-haired teen, it's that Izuku would stop at nothing when it comes to protecting his friends. And since Izuku's not here to light a fire under his classmates' asses in his positive, go-get-em kind of way, Hitoshi will have to do it himself, even if doing it himself means calling them out and potentially making enemies out of potential future classmates. There's a moment of silence, and Hitoshi just stews under it, the silence speaking volumes. Purple Bro's right. The redhead huffs in annoyance, and it's not exactly what Hitoshi expects in the slightest. That's what I've been saying. They need our help. They're our classmates, our friends. We can't just sit around and do nothing. You guys know just as well as I do that if Midoriya was here, he'd be stopping at nothing to get Bakugo back. But he's not, because he's the manliest of all of us, and he rushed into that void to try and get Bakubro back. He pauses, eyeing his classmates with a straight expression. Can any of us say the same? Bakugo is gone as well. That's a tiny detail his mother either didn't hear about or didn't think Hitoshi needed to hear. Doesn't really change anything, though. If they're going for Izuku, might as well bring back the hothead as well. We should take a page out of Midoriya's book, the redhead continues, because the way I'm looking at it, he's the only one who really went plus ultra out there. He's the only one who ran headfirst into that portal to rescue Bakugo. Yeah, I don't know, man. The golden-haired teen with the jagged black lightning bolt across his fringe shrugs awkwardly. It just doesn't seem like a very good idea. We are just students, and Aizawa-sensei would get pissed if we did anything. Do you not remember him telling us to stay put? Exactly, Ida snuffs. We had permission to use our training in combat at the time. That offer has long since been revoked. It is illegal to use our quirks. Sensei will probably already be getting into trouble for giving us permission during the attack. We, the blond boy in the fancy velvety-looking shirt nods. We shouldn't do anything that will get ourselves or our sensei into trouble. The pros and police will handle our missing classmates. We should leave this to them, no? I agree. A deep voice adds quietly, and Hitoshi glances over at the bird-headed boy. It's just not worth the risk of endangering more of us. I speak solely for myself when I say this, but I know my performance left much to be desired during the attack. I need to work harder with my quirk, and I know I'm not ready to fight the villains again yet. They were stronger than us, smarter. We're lucky to have made it out of that attack with our lives. A wave of mumbled agreements falls over the room, and Hitoshi can't help but feel sick. This isn't working. We can help them, though, the redhead urges desperately. You guys can't seriously be down to just sit and wait. We're Hero Course students. Midoriya would stop at nothing to save any of us if the roles were reversed. Hitoshi whips around to see where Todoroki is standing at the foot of Yaoyorozu's bed, hands tucked in his pockets of his sweatpants, and he's been quiet up until now. Quiet and hidden in the mess of his peers, so Hitoshi hadn't even noticed him. Hitoshi frowns thoughtfully at the dual-haired teen who's scanning over his peers' faces. Though Todoroki had been there when he'd joined Izuku and his friends for lunch those couple times, he hadn't really heard Todoroki speak or express an opinion much more than nods or shakes of his head. He's very quiet and withdrawn, as far as Hitoshi had noticed, so this is a bit of a surprise to him. The dual-haired teen glances around the room with a furrowed brow before his gaze settles on Ida and his mouth presses into a flat line. It's not really annoyance in Todoroki's expression, just maybe a bit of disappointment as the two of them glare back and forth silently. The red and white-haired teen draws his gaze after a second and continues on effortlessly. Midoriya has proven time and time again that he's got our backs. He rushed to the villains to try and rescue Bakugo when none of us did to that extent, even though he was badly injured. He's helped us with all of our quirks. He's been there to cover our asses. He's jumped at every opportunity to help us. A pointed look at Ida that Hitoshi can't even pretend to understand because everyone else, besides Ida, looks just as confused. He's had our backs, so why don't we have his? That's not fair, Todoroki-kun. Uraraka whispers. Deku wouldn't just run blindly into danger like this. Hitoshi narrows his eyes at the girl, just barely managing to keep the snappish "have you even met him?" to himself. Izuku 100% would charge into any fight blindly if it meant protecting someone. This is ridiculous, Ida huffs. I want our classmates home just as much as anyone else, but I cannot condone blatant rule-breaking like this. I won't be a part of it, and neither should any of us. Aizawa-sensei is doing everything he can, and I'm sure there'll be handfuls of other pros involved as well. We'd be nothing but nuisances getting in the way and interrupting their work. But we'd be helping our friends, the redhead argues in frustration. We can't keep arguing like this, Kero. Asui mumbles just loud enough for the group to hear. We all need to keep a level head, like Aizawa-sensei taught us. Running into this is a bad idea. Ida's right. We can't think with our emotions. We're not prepared for this. Please, think this through, Kirishima-kun, Todoroki-kun. If you do this, you'd be no different than the villains themselves. A stunned silence settles over the room. Hitoshi doesn't need to say anything to know that they'd already made up their minds. Anything and any arguing further would just be a waste of time. Hanging around when it's pointless is just waiting to be found by his uncles. Still, Hitoshi can't help but let the swirl of anger in his stomach twist. So that's it then, huh? Hitoshi scowls around at Izuku's classmates, hardly even seeing their faces through his own bristling anger. What's the point of becoming a hero if you won't be one when it counts? And with that, he turns on his heels and he walks out of the room. There's nothing else to be said. Just as he leaves, a doctor steps through the threshold of the room, and he sort of hears the students being dismissed. Dozens of footsteps promptly trail out after him. But he just quickens his pace, not sure he'd be able to see any of them without getting irrationally angry. Hitoshi tugs at his own hair as he walks, gnawing on his bottom lip. He stalks away from the hospital room, expression twisted in a scowl of defeat. God, that was a waste of time. The light overhead flickers, 2 blinks, and Hitoshi just glares upwards for a second without pausing in his steps or movements. You know, this is your fault. I shouldn't even be here. Whose fault? Hitoshi swirls around, coming face to face with the redhead 1A student, Kirishima if he had to hazard a guess. Asui had addressed Todoroki and Kirishima, the only two fighting for a rescue mission instead of against. The other teen looks sheepish as he looks around Hitoshi to try and spot whoever the purple-haired teen had been speaking to, not that there's anyone to see. Hitoshi scrunches up its nose and he shoots the unwavering overhead light fixture a glare. Hitoshi schools his features as he realizes with a start that this is one of the kids he'd just ripped into. Not directly, but as a whole. Honestly, after how he acted in there, a tiny part of him is expecting to be punched. He hadn't exactly left the room on a positive note, so he eyes the kid over his nose and leans to glance around him to see if any more 1A kids are making their way over, but it appears that they're alone. What? Hitoshi balks when his mind finally catches up to the question he'd been asked. Oh, nothing, just, venting. Right. Kirishima furrows his brow before shaking his head. His expression hardens, and Hitoshi wrinkles his nose as the 1A kid leans close and continues. It doesn't matter right now anyways. Did you mean it? Did I mean what? Hitoshi isn't sure he keeps the exhausted exasperation from his voice as he answers, but it doesn't seem to deter Kirishima at all. The other teen just puffs out his chest and narrows his eyes, and Hitoshi really feels like there will be a wrong way to answer the following question that very well may get him punched. What you said in there, when you were talking about going to rescue Bakugo and Midoriya, were you serious about that, about being involved? Hitoshi narrows his eyes in challenge. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Trust me, there's a lot riding on this, and if I got caught, I'm sure I'll either be throttled by my parents and uncles, or I'll spend the rest of my life in the confines of my bedroom, in the grounding of a lifetime, maybe even both, depending on how this goes. Kirishima stares into Hitoshi's eyes, searching. It feels like he's literally searching Hitoshi's soul, and it's one of the most unpleasant things Hitoshi's ever been through, but he doesn't risk looking away. Finally, after what feels like forever, the redhead blinks and easily grabs both of Hitoshi's shoulders in a tight, serious grip. We have a plan. And that's all Hitoshi needs to hear. Shota had been right to heed Nezu's warning as he realizes as he's sitting in a conference table with Nezu himself and Vladimir on the other side of him. He'd heeded it, technically, but he wishes now that maybe he'd really taken the warning to heart. Maybe if he actually slept instead of just resting his eyes in the presence of his husband before sitting up and getting back to work attempting to find his kids, he wouldn't feel as awful as he does. He already has a headache, and he's sure it's not about to leave any time soon. It's not even noon, and yet his head is pounding, and his thoughts muddle together in that way he hates. The burning behind his eyes is intense, and he's sure that when he finally lets his body rest, he'll have one hell of a migraine. He's sure it'll get worse from here on out until his kids are home safe and sound. It always does, when he's in a dour mood and he overuses his quirk and doesn't get enough sleep. Plus there's the fact that he's been forced into a monkey suit with slicked back hair courtesy of Hisashi, and that annoyed him even more. He hates dressing up, and to be doing it now to look presentable for people he honestly couldn't give two shits about when two of his students are missing, when Izuku is missing, pisses him off. It's the most presentable he's looked since his wedding day, and it sucks he's doing it for show, playing Nezu's little publicity game to please the public and get them off Yuei's ass, like they don't have better things to be doing than sitting around playing dress-up and getting asked illogical questions about what happened instead of trying to fix it. God, he hates limelight stuff. This is a waste of time. Okay, maybe Nezu had been right yesterday when he'd made that comment about not trusting Shota to be able to hold a civil conversation for long. He's still not the best candidate, but he knows if Nezu could get away with Shota not being here, he would. As much as the rodent likes to watch humankind suffer, that sadistic rat that he is, he knows that Nezu has some class and prides himself on Yuei's image, which is taking quite the hit right now. Shota is arguably the least ideal person to have here, but somehow his name had been leaked as the teaching pro along with Vlad, so there's literally no way to weasel out of it, without causing a stir that'll likely drag Yuei's name through the mud again. Breaking news. Pro teacher refuses to accept responsibility for negligence after 2 students go missing on a school field trip. What kinds of people are teaching our children? Is Yuei High School really safe? God, he can see the headline now. Each one more ridiculous than the last, as the media tends to do. Any headline that'll get clicks and attention, even if it's obscenely fake and obviously reaching. Hence why he's suffering through this without much of a complaint to his boss. Sitting here, the center of attention, not just any attention, but the media's attention, reminds Shota why he chose underground heroics in the first place. He's ready for it to be over with, before he even steps out of the car Nezu had sent to the hospital to pick him and Vlad up. He probably should have taken more downtime than he had, and his head is pounding, and his eyes burn. He so badly wants to shut his eyes and sleep, but even if he could, he knows he'd never be able to. Every time he shuts his eyes, all he sees is Izuku's busted-up arms, broken arms that Shota had let him walk away with. And his bruised face, and then he sees Shigaraki's hand settled on the teen's face, just like Shigaraki's hand had gripped his own elbow. He can only watch helplessly, desperately, as Shigaraki makes 5 points of contact and Izuku starts to crumble away until he swallows down the fear, squeezing his eyes shut as he takes a breath. Settled at the table in front of dozens of reporters and multiple cameras in the last place one should be having a panic attack, he needs to get himself together. Last thing that he needs is for the public to get some crazy idea that he's incompetent or something simply because he's stressed and panicking, and this is not helping with literally anything. It takes a second, but he manages to force himself back to the now, focusing on the loud demand for answers and shouted accusations, focuses on Nezu's calming words as he tries to talk down what Shota would only call a mob of reporters. Nezu had always had a way with words, and Shota's so incredibly glad that, for now, he tries to not glare out at the crowd of squawking vultures. He's tired and annoyed and worried and anxious, and honestly he feels like throwing up, but the media vultures carry on with their demanding questions and uneducated accusations. They're here demanding things when they don't know what happened. They don't know what went down and how Shota and Vlad and the Pussycats had given their all to keep those kids safe. How they still failed, because the League chose to attack when they were all separated, when the students were broken off into groups instead of as a whole, when the pros were by themselves with small groups of kids. They attacked when they were at their weakest. How, despite their efforts, 2 students, 2 kids, had been taken, and they have to live with that, even without reporters shoving it in their faces. For God's sake, he knows they failed. He's well aware. The apology goes well, more or less, It doesn't appear to satisfy most of the crowd, but at the same time, they'll probably get some credit for hosting this and providing what little information they can. Shota tries not to look at them, as the shouts get angrier and more vicious. Nezu works tirelessly to calm them down and provide careful, thought-out answers to their questions. Nezu talks of taking strong measures to ensure student safety on campus, and Shota's a little curious what his boss has in mind, since Nezu doesn't expand on it. Nezu does, however, talk of strengthening their security measures and re-examining Yuei's crime prevention system, which definitely should have been done earlier. It really was time to pull their heads out of their asses. These threats and attacks aren't one-time things. They aren't going to stop, apparently. Still, they don't seem impressed. They're angry, enraged, demanding more than they can offer at the time, and genuinely questioning the student safety at the school, questioning the teachers' ability to keep their kids safe, like Shota and Vlad's mistakes reflect on the entire staff. Then, of course, it only makes sense that Shota is singled out by one journalist with venomous eyes and an accusing tone. It does make sense. He'd been the one to give the order for the kids to use their quirks illegally. He's well aware that's a controversial decision, and had known it at the time as well. It's no secret he'd told his kids to use their quirks. Honestly, he'd much rather have backlash now than have to face any of his students losing their lives. It's the most logical solution, even thinking back now, after the majority of the storm had passed, and he's calmed and thinking clearly. He knows he'd do it all again, in a heartbeat, if it meant his students survived. If he could go back and change things about that night, he would, definitely, but the one thing he wouldn't change is giving them permission to protect themselves and each other. He strongly believes there was no casualties because they protected themselves. Shota's so glad that they did. He honestly doesn't remember what he says when his patience finally snaps a little, as the insistent journalist doesn't let up. He's caught up in defending his two students. The journalist has no right to turn this around on Bakugo, who is a missing child. He has no right to doubt the child in question due to past instances. His irritation might show faintly, but he's quick to replace it with a calm, almost apologetic air. He thinks he does a good job keeping his cool while still getting his message across. His defense of these students, who the media has no right to pretend they know, his defense of Bakugo's character, which these people are seeing as nothing more than explosive and hot-headed when he's so much more temper aside. He knows Bakugo has some flaws that Shota will be working hard to help the kid overcome, but that doesn't mean he's a villain. The audacity of this journalist has Shota's hands curling into fists. He won't try to defend himself here. He knows he's in the wrong. He knows he could have done better. He knows. Defending himself would be illogical, really, when he's well aware there are things he could have done differently. Choices he could have made that would have changed this outcome. So no, he won't defend himself against them, but he sure as hell will defend his students. Christ, he hates the media. Information on the League of Villains comes in after Shota has arrived back at the hospital. His students are mostly in the process of getting released, and parents and guardians have been picking them up from Hisashi, who promised to hang around while Shota was dragged away. He'd been beyond glad to return to the hospital to his husband's waiting arms. A TV in one of the conference rooms they'd all but taken over at Nezu's chipper insistence turned into what Shota can only assume was one of the many channels airing the press conference. The sad look of sympathy is enough for Shota to know Hisashi, like the rest of Japan, had tuned in, and he'd watched the whole thing, if the familiar glow of anger in his eyes is anything to go by. When they finally pull away from the tender hug, Hisashi gestures with a nod of his head to a stack of clothes on the table, and Shota decides then that he's never been more in love with this man than he is right now. Hisashi's a godsend, and nothing will ever change his mind. He sits at the table after he's dressed in dark sweatpants and a dark blue sweatshirt, one that he's almost positive came from Hisashi's side of the closet, letting his head drop onto the tabletop with a thump. He doesn't even get to rest for a couple of minutes before his phone is ringing, and he's snapping to attention as he fumbles to answer. It's an anonymous tip, called into the special police line Tsukuchi set up. Shota had sent out brief descriptions of villains that they came in contact with who had managed to get away. Amongst them had been the scarred villain who Shota had fought outside of the lodge. The anonymous tip had been nothing but a report of someone seeing a person of that description entering a bar in a sleazier part of Kamino. Still, it's more than they expected to end up getting, and Shota's beyond grateful. He's not invited to the meeting, considering that UA teachers are still a hot topic when it comes to media coverage, but is assured that high-ranking pros have made it their mission to get the students back. Shota has no doubt that All Might is among them. As much as he thinks Yagi lacks when it comes to teaching, and that he's a bit out of his depth when it comes to interacting with students, he knows the man's a good pro-hero, and he knows he has a soft spot for Izuku as well. Makes him feel a little bit better about the fact that he and Hisashi are finally being benched in the rescue mission when he knows that All Might will be there. Shota and Hisashi wait at the hospital. Even if most of the students have been discharged, Vlad still has some students unconscious, and a few of Shota's own kids will be getting discharged later in the day. Plus, it can't hurt to be here when Izuku and Bakugo are brought in. It'll save time. Logical. Still, Shota can't help but grumble about how this is the absolute worst part about being a pro. Knowing things are in motion, and not being able to assist. Izashi is in silent agreement as he matches Shota's slumped, almost reclined position in his office chair, somehow managing to lean against Shota while balanced vicariously in the office chair matching Shota's own. The dark-haired man heaves a sigh when he lets his head settle against Izashi's, which is resting on his shoulder as he catches Izashi's hand, where it rests on his thigh, and interlaces their fingers together. Izashi doesn't say anything, but he does give a squeeze back. Sitting and waiting is definitely the worst. Oboro tucks close enough to Hitoshi to be a part of the conversation, but he keeps enough distance to not accidentally touch the kid. They're stood outside the hospital waiting for Yaoyorozu to finish being discharged so they can leave. Hitoshi is half hiding behind a bush, and it's fairly common knowledge that both Shota and Hizashi had been hanging around the hospital. Hitoshi would definitely be dead if either of them caught him, and then their whole plan would fall to pieces. And that can't happen, not when they're so close now. He'd known, when he started flickering lights in Izuku's bedroom in reply to Hitoshi's questions, that there was a very good chance that this would fail. But it hadn't. Sure, there were some bumps along the way, but he somehow managed to drag the kid to where 1A students were talking. He'd heard by accident, really, the plan that some of the students were brewing up, or the beginnings of one at least. Shota had been one of the first to hear when Yaoyorozu had woken up. As expected, he'd been out of his seat and beelining down the hall. Oboro had followed, after his school friend, and settled in the doorway as Shota gave the girl a worried scan before he'd offered her a tiny yet relieved smile. Shota had sat in the chair at her bedside for a little while, talking softly to her. It was seeing this, interactions like this between Shota and the children he teaches, or even just children in general, that had always made Oboro think he'd make a great teacher. And he was right. There's something so soft about how he manipulates his aura from hard-ass, strict, and occasionally terrifying teacher to soft-spoken and calming like now. She'd woken up, bleary-eyed and confused, a frown tugging at her lips as she gave her teacher a once-over, before her expression melted away to a carefully constructed blankness. She remembered, clearly. When she'd woken up, it had been roughly 15 hours since the attack on the camp, since Izuku and Bakugo had been taken. Oboro himself had been trying to keep himself busy. He'd spent most of his time with Hitoshi, but he jumped around between his school friends, too. He'd spent the morning with Hitoshi, though, heart pounding hopefully in his chest as he trailed after the purple-haired teen who was making his way to the apartment. It was only when Hitoshi was on the bus heading in the right direction that Oboro took the time to step away to check on his friends again. And it happened to be just around that time that Yaoyorozu woke. Shota didn't stick around long in the teen's room when he made sure she was okay, but Oboro did, in the most not creepy way possible. His interest had been piqued as she waits for Shota to leave before shuffling around, and he couldn't help but chase the curiosity and stick around. He stepped into the room further, tucked himself into a corner as he watched her shuffle through her belongings until she pulled out some sort of technology thing. He really had no idea what it was. It looked like it was a little outdated to be a phone, and if it is, it's one that Oboro had never seen in all his years, both alive and just hanging around. And he only gets a bit more curious when she's just staring down at it thoughtfully, thumbing over a blinking dot on the screen. He thought about getting closer, but didn't want to risk getting too close. Oboro didn't get an answer to his internal questions until some of Izuku's classmates filtered into the room to see her. A tracker. That clever girl had put a tracker on a Nomu. There was hope. Oboro didn't stick around long after that, blinking himself into Izuku's room where a suspicious Hitoshi had squinted up at the ceiling. Oboro hopes that he hadn't been waiting long, but he's quick to fiddle around with the light bulb before Hitoshi leaves in a huff at the lack of ghostly interference. It had been a lot of work to talk to Hitoshi without Izuku. Oboro desperately wished that he had some kind of control, that he could touch things still, but every time he tried, he went right through. It was the most frustrating thing. He'd been used to touching things with Izuku's help, and to suddenly have it stripped away, he honestly feels like when he'd first realized he was a ghost. Still, by some miracle, they make progress. Oboro manages to lead the teen to the hospital, and through the hospital with only a couple of hiccups. He's beyond relieved to find the 1A kids still gathered in Yaoyorozu's room when he'd popped in while Hitoshi had been in the elevator. He really does wish that he could have warned Hitoshi, but, well, he's a ghost. Can't give someone a heads up when all you can do is flicker a light, and to be honest, he only feels a little bad about throwing the teen at 1A. They'll probably be classmates soon anyways. And if Shota doesn't kill Hitoshi for this when he finds out. And Hitoshi will have to get through Yuuei too, and she's scarier. The chat doesn't go as well as planned. Obero's a little surprised to see so many 1A kids willing to stay back and let the professionals handle the situation. Shota will probably be ecstatic. They have some common sense, but Obero really wasn't expecting that twist. Obero's attention flicks back and forth like he's watching a tennis ball fly over a net when it comes to 1A bickering. He can just sit on the edge of his seat and he waits for a verdict. He wants to cry when they finally come to a conclusion, and not a favorable one at that. Hitoshi leaves the room in a foul mood, and Obero follows dejectedly. They aren't going to help. What is he supposed to do now? How is he supposed to help Izuku? He doesn't know how the tracker works. He can't lead Hitoshi somewhere he doesn't know, and he refuses to lure a single kid, a child, to a villain's hideout all alone. Even if he could, it's not right. He wouldn't be much of a hero himself if he led Hitoshi to the villains and expected him to save Izuku and Bakugo single-handedly. Hitoshi's grumbling to himself as he stalks down the hallways. He may actually be grumbling to Obero, but Ghost isn't entirely sure. Still, he offers his presence in nothing more than a quick flicker of overhead lights directly above Hitoshi. Obero can't help but perk up when Kirishima rounds the corner, rushing behind Hitoshi with a sense of urgency. Turns out, not all the students are against the rescue mission. Hitoshi is led back to Yaoyorozu's now empty hospital room where she and Todoroki are waiting. The icy hot teen is perched on the edge of the foot of the bed, and as soon as Hitoshi and Kirishima are in the room, the redhead is easing the door shut behind them. Then, suddenly, there was a plan. It was half-baked, really. As he stands out in the corner of the room, he can't help but wince as they talk about rushing right into the villain's secret hideout, but Obero bites his lip as he flickers the bathroom light, just enough to catch Hitoshi's attention. He's desperate to get Izuku back too, but even he knows that they're likely to fail if they don't give this any thought past following the tracker to the pinged location and finding a way in. The rescue aspect is far too broad for Obero's taste, and he makes sure to convey that through frantic flickering that draws in suspicious-looking Todoroki's gaze as well. They plot for a while, until Hitoshi's phone chimes with a text from his mother requesting him to return home for the night. The four of them decide to take the night to prepare, rest, and think this through before meeting in the morning to iron out the details of the plan. It only makes sense, since Hitoshi had to get home, and both he and Obero know that a search party will form if he doesn't show up, and Yaoyorozu is stuck in the hospital for overnight observation due to her head injury. They'd be more likely to be found out if Hitoshi went missing in the night, or if Yaoyorozu disappeared from the hospital with no trace. Shota would definitely be on their trail then, and the longer they can do this without interference, the better. Now, though, early the following evening, they stand in a group and wait for the one with the tracker. She'd already been discharged, but was just getting dressed into clothes that weren't a papery hospital-provided set of pajamas. "Hey, are you, hiding in the bush?" Obero snorts a laugh to himself at Kirishima's awkward question. Hitoshi stiffens, where he is, in fact, hiding partially in the hospital shrubs. "Yeah, Hitoshi rubs at the back of his neck. "Sorta. Aizawa-sensei can't know I'm here. It would be detrimental if he found out, and I'm pretty sure death would be more pleasant." "Oh, yeah, right." Kirishima nods seriously. "He'd probably give you detention, right? He is pretty scary, you know. It's pretty manly of you to come along. I mean, you're not even in our class. You're risking so much to help." Yeah." Hitoshi hops out sheepishly. "Something like that." Hitoshi's quiet for a second before he shakes his head. "Izuku's practically family. I'd do anything for him, and I know he'd do the same for me, too." Kirishima nods solemnly, wiping at watery eyes as he claps Hitoshi on the shoulder. "So manly." Takes a couple more minutes for Yaoyorozu to finally emerge from the hospital, tracker clutched in hand, and she glances sharply but kindly at the boys waiting for her. "Everyone ready?" Obero can't say he's surprised that the four of them actually all show up to get ready to go, but what is surprising is Tenya joining them with a slumped set of shoulders and a glare shot at Todoroki. It definitely has something to do with Stain, probably, unless they have some other kind of beef he doesn't know about. Tenya says that he's just here to make sure his classmates don't do anything stupid, which is probably true, but Obero can see a light familiar to Tensei's sheer determination shining in the younger Ida's gaze as well. He's proud of the young man that Tenya's become, a lot like his older brother. Oboro actually feels a little better now that Tenya's joining the party, responsible and rational, and hopefully he'll be able to wrangle his classmates so they don't do anything stupid or dangerous. Hope swirls in the ghost chest as the group of 5 heads away from the hospital, already bickering about which train to get on and which direction will be fastest. Maybe this will actually work? God, for Izuku's sake, he really hopes so. More hours pass. Izuku hurts a lot more now. He hurts to the point that his face is permanently twisted in agony, and the poor little ghost child looks so worried. Kacchan at his side keeps muttering about how much of a fucking idiot he is for following him, but Izuku hears the concern in his snarling tone and promises for the both of them that he's all right. He's really not. He's been sitting with broken arms for 2 days now. 2 days at least. He's lost some time when the pain outweighs the fear and he succumbs to unconsciousness, but he's sure it's been over 48 hours in the time that he's been awake. Kurogiri is always kind enough to offer the time if Izuku's head is clear enough to do some mental math. It's been quite a few hours since Kurogiri had given him some Advil. He hadn't even seen the void-quirked villain since Shigaraki had strolled into the room after another long day of sleep. Izuku knows that he just goes quiet now, painfully quiet to the point where Kacchan's heel presses back into his shin where he has just enough give in his chains to move. Izuku can't help but think that Kacchan's more worried about him than he's letting on, and it's honestly touching. I don't like that you're as hurt as you are. Hana is once again sitting in front of him, tucked into a small little ball as she stares at him with cat-like eyes. That's also touching. I'm okay, he tells her softly, barely aware of the villains in the room. Most are in the room, but they're all so busy talking at the booths to notice Izuku talking to nothing. Kacchan does, though, but he smartly keeps quiet. You're not, she insists. You're really hurt, and Tenko and Kurogiri don't care, and the rest of them don't even look at you. I don't want you to die, too. Izuku sucks in a shaky breath. I won't die, Hana. Damn fucking right you won't, Kacchan hisses under his breath. Deku won't die, you shitty little brat. Don't say things like that. Hana's nose wrinkles as she regards Kacchan. He's right, Izuku nods slowly. It's just breaks. Believe it or not, this has happened before. Well, not the being kidnapped part, but breaking my bones. Would you believe I broke both my legs and my arm at the same time? Don't worry, okay? As soon as we're rescued, I'll be fixed up by the hospital and probably some healing quirks, and then I'll be good as new. What if that takes too long? Izuku doesn't know how to console the little girl. It's obvious Hana's too clever to just believe his words, and he shudders at the thought of what this child must have seen hanging around this bar. Izuku just wilts under her intense gaze. He doesn't have a response. You said your ghost friend could help you. Izuku cocks his head as he listens. Can I help at all? A no sits on the tip of his tongue. They'd already determined that Hana would not be able to locate Shota or Hisashi or Oboro or Hitoshi. He doubts that she'd even know any of the other pros that Izuku could send her to find. But then he thinks back to Oboro being able to interact with things. Maybe she could untie his knots. He could probably get Kacchan unlocked if he could just move his arms without the restraints. Do you know how to untie knots? Izuku asks quietly. Hana looks momentarily confused before she leans down to look at the knots tying his wrists together, and to the leg of Kacchan's chair. Kacchan himself jolts slightly against his own restraints, blowing out a quiet breath of what Izuku could almost hear as hope. The little girl furrows her brow. Maybe. I'm not good at touching stuff, though. Try touching me, Izuku offers desperately. It should work. He's not too cold. Todoroki isn't around, and Hana hasn't touched him. The bar is actually pleasantly warm, considering it's a villain lair, and he hasn't even been hearing whispers of the vestiges, which is a little bit worrying. He can't see a reason why she wouldn't be able to channel his energy into untying the ropes, which is why he is completely thrown for a loop when she goes to touch his knee and it faces right through. Izuku sucks in a startled breath at the assault of cold, but it didn't feel anything like the cold he felt when he developed hypothermia in Hosu. I'm sorry, Hana yelps. Are you okay? You said I should... Tenko always hates when I try and touch him. He complains that I'm cold. I thought you said I'd be different. Izuku tried to formulate a response, but all he can really think is why? Why hadn't that worked? He tried to open himself up like he practiced with Oboro. There should be no reason why it didn't work. Oboro touching him was like second nature now, and Izuku did exactly the same thing he'd do if it was Oboro reaching for him, and it hadn't worked. What? Is something supposed to happen now, Deku? Because it sure as shit ain't. Shit. Izuku seethes out under his breath. I don't know what. Try again? The little girl looks nervous, but she reaches out to touch him again and still just phases through. I don't understand. Izuku squeezes his eyes shut. You should be able to. Why isn't it working? Why isn't what working? Izuku and Kacchan tense up simultaneously as Shigaraki's drawl snaps from the doorway. He stood, scanning over them like he's looking for some plot or plan that they're coming up with, looking right over Hana. Izuku curses the villain's very existence as their plan shuffles away from them cautiously. What are you hero brats doing? The villain sneers unhappily. An escape plan is pointless. There's no point trying to get past us, and if you try, you're as good as dead. Got it? Izuku manages a weak, distracted nod, while Kacchan just grinds his teeth angry. I'm sorry, Mr. Hero, Hana whispers from the bar. I tried to help. He gives her a small smile and a nod. He doesn't want her to take any blame for this. He doesn't know why his quirk isn't working with her, but that's not her fault. Shigaraki had made himself busy in front of a TV in the room, clicking through the channels before he grins to himself. Sensei mentioned this would be on, and I love to watch heroes squirm. Boo-hoo, you two NPCs went missing, whatever. Izuku looks up to see Shota, Nezu, and Vlad King on the screen. He frowns to himself at their dressed-up attire, and it takes probably long second to realize that they're doing a press conference. About them. Oh, God. The other villains gather to watch the conference as well, but they're kind enough or cruel enough, depending on how you look at it, to leave a gap so Izuku and Kacchan can see the TV as well. Most of the villains just turn to watch along, all looking disgustingly amused. This aired earlier today, but it's been on reruns since. Shigaraki smiles scarily, enjoying the way that their teachers suffer through the questions. Look at that. Eraserhead looks like he's going to cry. I thought he was tougher than that. Stupid heroes. He should be glad I took you two insufferable brats, less dumb hero kids to babysit. Izuku feels his own eyes water as the conference continues, as his teachers apologize for something that's not even remotely their fault. It's Shigaraki's fault. He's the one who ordered the attack on the camp and kidnapped them. Enjoying the show, hero brat? Shigaraki taunts. Are you enjoying watching your high and mighty teachers at the mercy of the public? Not so tough now, are they? Izuku just shrinks in on himself as Shota bows apologetically, apologizing for something that's not his fault, on live TV. He just wants to go home. All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 31 of Yuuei Survival Guide. Chapter 32 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.